before heading south by some spectacular tarmac tests, and then on to some typical desert sections. Al Hajri continued to extend his lead, the smooth open stages ideally suiting the Porsche. The only two crews to pose a threat were Michel Sala and Mohammed bin Sulayem, although Sulayem was finding his task even more difficult as the turbo pressure was dropping on the Celica. To further compound his misery, the engine began to cut out mysteriously, costing him valuable time. Of the others, George Haddad was putting in a spirited drive in his aging Celica GT. After a rest halt in Petra, crews headed back north again towards Amman, via some more dusty desert stages. On the first day of the rally, crews had run at 1-minute intervals, but for the second and third legs, when there was more desert stages, the gap was increased to 3 minutes to alleviate the dust problem. For Michel Sala, the morning had been a disaster when his service barge caught fire, completely destroying the entire outfit. It was his good fortune that teammate Nabil Karam retired and he was able to use his service barge. It wasn't dust that was Mohammed bin Sulayem's problem, however, but his engine. Despite changing almost everything they could on the car's electrics, it still refused to pull properly, and he was dropping a lot of time to his rivals. George Haddad still held on to 4th place, but had not been without his share of problems, which included a front suspension change at Petra. George Kayat, under the expert tuition of Bill Gwynn, was hanging on to his 5th place and was having a relatively trouble-free run. Having improved considerably on their number 21 seed are Jamal Maravi and Sadak Ashkanani in their Datsun 160J. They lay in 6th position. An electrical fault causing the headlamps to flash. Or could it be they're just pleased to see us? The leading Group A car was the Talbot Sunbeam, driven by the British crew of David Jepson and Ray Milward. They had overcome clutch and gearbox troubles on the first day to climb steadily back up the leaderboard. The crew that had been expected to do well in Group A were Mamdou Kayat and Tony McMahon in the Toyota Corolla. They had problems from day one, when at the end of stage 5 they stopped for 25 minutes when the camshaft timing slipped. By the time repairs were carried out, they had dropped 30 minutes road penalties, and effectively any chance of taking a good result. The third day was very similar to the second, and featured some really first-class tarmac stages, usually winding their way up the steep sides of escarpments. The Porsche of Al Hajri and Spiller continued to lead. The gap to the second-place crew, over 8 minutes. Third position was still held by Mohammed bin Sulayem and John Daniels. They were going better now that their engine problems appeared to be cured, and they actually made second fastest time on this stage. George Haddad and George Kayat still hold 4th and 5th positions, with Kayat beating his rival by 12 seconds here. The gap between them, however, was over 14 minutes. After the tarmac, it was back into the desert again. Al Hajri maintained his pace, although not setting fastest stage times, but then why should he with an 8-minute lead? Mohammed bin Sulayem set a string of fastest times over the early gravel stages, pulling back time on Sala. Sadly, his bold charge came to naught when, on stage 31, he broke a steering track rod end and dropped over 6 minutes. Sala, meanwhile, continued his game chase of Al Hajri. For once, the Kuwaiti driver was driving with his head and not his heart. The first stage out of Petra was an 8-kilometre tarmac hill climb, not unlike some of the stages found on the old Alpine rallies of years ago. Again, Al Hajri took a fastest time, the tarmac suiting the Porsche far more than the others. This despite easing off for the last section of the rally, in order to preserve the car. Michel Sala still tried his best, flinging the Manta through the bends, but was nevertheless 10 seconds behind Hajri on this stage. Bin Sulayem was a further 3 seconds in arrears, and was probably looking forward to finishing more than most, after his run of bad luck. His engine again refused to pull cleanly, and just to make it to the finish was now his aim. Desperately trying to make up for his time loss earlier, George Haddad, who uses all the road and a bit more in his efforts. But it was all to come to naught when they retired at the end of this stage. Leading Group A, after all the Corollas struck problems of one sort or another, the little Talbot Sunbeam of Jepson and Millwall, who now hold 5th position. Jamal Maravi and Adek Ashkenani are putting in a brave performance in their aging Datsun, still flashing its lights. Problems, and of course the loss of their service vehicle. Al Hajri seems to have matured of late. Perhaps his sorties to Europe to compete there have sharpened him up and given him a more competitive edge. Certainly for him and the Rothmans team, it was a first-class result on an event that is pushing hard for World Championship status and is possibly not too far away from that achievement.